So in this video, we will be discussing what a midpoint is and also discussing what a segment bisector is. So make sure that you're writing down notes as we go through and pause when you need to take time to write down the definitions. But the definition of a midpoint is a point that divides a segment into two congruent parts. So if we're looking at this segment AB and we see this point P, if P is the midpoint of segment AB, then what that's saying is this segment AP has to be congruent to segment PB. Okay. Notice how they have the same length. Okay, AP equals PB. So once they have the same length, then we can say that these segments are congruent. Okay, so just a reminder from a few lessons ago, how we mark congruence on a diagram. So if R is the midpoint of segment QS, then which segments are congruent? So we know that R is the midpoint, so segment QR is congruent to segment RS. So remember, we have tick marks to help us recognize where line segments are congruent. So since we have tick marks on there, we can see and recognize QR is congruent to RS. So we have to use tick marks. Okay. So if NQ, so this segment NQ has a midpoint of M, that means NM and MQ are congruent. So anytime you see this language that NQ has a midpoint of M, we should mark congruence on the diagram. Okay. So now we're going to get into some different language. We know that M is the midpoint. Okay. And so if we have this ray MR in the second diagram, okay, this ray MR, we can say that ray MR is not the midpoint, but ray MR bisects segment NQ. Okay, so think about this word. So sections, right? And then by two, so it's breaking up into two parts. And these two parts will be congruent. So here is the definition of a segment bisector. A segment bisector is a line, segment, or ray that intersects the segment at its midpoint. A line, segment, or ray that intersects the segment at its midpoint. So if we have these few diagrams, I have a few. If line MR is a bisector of segment NQ, then what that's saying is NM is congruent to MQ. So notice how this line MR cuts through this segment NQ at the midpoint M. Okay, so saying that it's a bisector indicates that point M is directly the midpoint between N and Q. For the second one, if segment MP is a bisector of NQ, then we can say NM is congruent to MQ. Okay, so there are different elements, different things that can bisect a segment. So we have a point, okay, the midpoint, it has to pass through the midpoint of the segment. Okay, so let's do 3 examples. I want you to look at this example, draw it, write it down, and I want you to find the length of PQ, the length of QS, and the length of PS, if Q is the midpoint of this segment. So pause the video and try this out to test your knowledge. Okay, so since Q is the midpoint, I need to mark the diagram for congruence. So since I see that there's a single tick mark on each, I know that 6x minus 7 equals 5x plus 1. And this is an equation that we can solve. So I got x equals 8. And if x equals 8, that means 6 times 8 minus 7 that is 41. And if this length is 41, and we know Q is the midpoint, then this length is 41, and that this whole length of PS is 82. So the key thing about this is marking the congruence so you know which pieces you can set equal to each other. Okay, so let's set this one up together, and then I'll let you pause to continue to solve. If you want to pause right now, you can do that. But we know that segment DE bisects segment AB at point C. Okay, so I'm going to draw segment AB here. And DE bisects this segment. So AB is the segment that's being split in half. So I'm going to put a midpoint there, but it intersects at C, so I know that C has to be the midpoint. And if DE bisects AB, then AB is the piece that's being cut in half, meaning AC has to be congruent to segment CB. Okay, so it's just bisecting the single segment AB. So if AC, the length of AC is 8x minus 3, and the length of CB is 4x plus 57, solve for x. So pause the video and think about how we can solve for x. Okay, so if we set these equal to each other, I get x to equal 15. Okay. All right, let's try this next one. I want you all to pause the video after we read it together, draw a picture, label it, and see if you can find the length of it, find x and the length of segment CT. So A is the midpoint of segment CT. CA equals 2x plus 8 and AT equals 4x plus 2. Find x and the length of CT. So pause the video, attempt the problem on your own, and then when you finish, hit play to see how you did. Okay, so I'm going to draw segment CT, and if A is the midpoint, then those two pieces are congruent. So if CA is 2x plus 8 and AT is 4x plus 2, then I know that these two pieces are congruent, and I can set them equal to each other. And when we solve by balancing the equations, I get 6 equals 2x. So x equals 3. And so the length of CT, that whole thing, we can find 2 times 3 plus 8, which is 14. So if these are both 14, then the whole length is 28. All right, how'd you do?